Hey guys, it's Ornlu, and yes, it is time for another tournament recap as King of the Desert 4 KOTD4 just finished this past weekend, and as usual with the big AOE2 events, I'm just going to go through, well, a recap, going to talk about, obviously the results, so spoilers, definitely click away if you don't want to get spoiled. But talk about the major storylines of the event. I did cast almost all of it, at least once the group stage started. Then I'll be going over all these other things I have listed on the screen. A lot of like the game stuff, the meta game. I want to talk about the map script a little bit, and then I do have a spreadsheet of stats for you guys that was done by mostly Nerfox and not myself, so it actually looks good. And then I'm going to finally wrap up with the more, AOE2 community stuff. How does KOTD4 fit into the AOE2 community tournament scene, especially now that we are in the context of having both AOE2 and AOE4 coexist? So with all of this in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the Wikipedia page just so we can see what the heck happened in this tournament. So here we are on the Wikipedia page for this event. I guess I'll link that in the description. Of course, King of the Desert 4, it is the 4th edition of this tournament, hosted by Memb TV, was sponsored by Microsoft, Pins Tech, and Meshuggah. And yeah, $72,600 event, huge event. This is definitely one of the, pillars, of the AOE2 tournament circuit alongside Hidden Cup and what used to be an AC, but now we don't really have that because of COVID. So I guess we used to have Red Bull, but now we don't have that anymore. So we're kind of in a period of flux right now. But regardless, of course, the Viper did end up winning this event, notable in that he won the first Age of Empires 4 major tournament with Genesis, and then also even won Red Bull just before that. So Viper is on a bit of a winning streak once again. But let's just go through this. There was a whole qualification stage. I'm not really going to go over that because there were 16 invited players and 16 qualified players, and they all met in the round of 32 and essentially one final qualification round. And 13 out of the 16 invited players ended up winning their match against the qualified player. So really, we only had a few upsets, so to say. We had Slam beating Backed after a semi-confusing internet issue-ridden day. Back definitely not playing at his best. Slam, I mean, it's not that much of an upset, I'd say, if at all. Then we had Sito winning barely over Kapach. That was a really close set, and we'll talk more about Sito later, but he's definitely one of the big up-and-coming players. Kosva, again, similarly, barely edging out over Vivi. These are the three qualified players who ended up making it to the main event. These are also three probably of the closest matches you would think on paper. Nothing else was, I think, all that crazy interesting except the Viper versus Say My Name. As Say My Name, the Vietnamese player, was able to take Viper to 5 games, and it was even up 2-1 at one point. Actually, a very good set. Combination of Viper playing a little bit off, at least in a couple of games, but also, I think, underratedly, Say My Name playing really well. But, of course, Viper did end up winning that because he won the whole tournament, duh! Then we moved on to the group stage of the event. Essentially, we had 2 groups that we kind of sort of did a Swiss stage. Essentially, it's just a double elimination bracket. You win 2, you're through, and if you lose 2, you're out. And as you can see, the results from the group stage here, I guess we'll start with Group A. Leary able to win, didn't have the cleanest time. He did barely edge out over Tato in the end in a super close set, but Leary did, advance in first place. Yo also actually sweeping his group, sweeping both Dogao and Doubt, also advancing in essentially first place. And then the players who had to battle it out were Tato and Valessa, who were able to edge it out over Nikov and Doubt respectively. I think when we look at Tato, Valessa, Doubt, Nikov, and even Dogao and maybe Slam, like a lot of these guys are going to be really close. I would say that maybe Doubt losing to Valessa is like the closest thing we had to an upset, but still a lot of very closely matched players, but I'd still say that this is a pretty much an expected result. A bit of an unfortunate performance though for Dogao, I gotta say. Moving on to Group B, we had the Viper easily sweep his group, easily beat Kosva, and then MBL. Jordan also, I think, a bit surprising. I think people are a little like, okay, where exactly is Jordan right now skill-wise? And he's had some very consistent results, and he was similarly consistent here, able to beat ACCM, who was playing a little too greedy, and then able to beat Hera, who looked a bit off, I've got to say. It wasn't the Hera we know and love, but Jordan was actually able to advance alongside Viper at the head of their group. And then for the fighting it out, we had Vinchester barely beating out Hera. Again, another bit of an upset. Winchester, this is where this is where his reapering begun. Definitely sort of the breakout player of the tournament, even though he's been around for years, which is kind of weird to say, but I guess that's kind of the case. Winchester, he barely beat Kosfa, and then he barely beats Hera after losing to MBL, and he is able to advance. And then Sito, similarly, able to edge it out just barely over ACCM, and then able to, I think, pretty decisively beat MBL. And yes, that does mean that Hera and MBL are knocked out during the group stage. Hera, obviously, fan favorite, usually considered one of the top 4 players, just not the greatest showing from him, unfortunately. And then MBL, literally the runner-up of the last event, did get knocked out. And then ACCM and Kosfa just kind of having a bit of a rough time. But regardless, that brings us now to the quarterfinals. And yeah, here's where some things get interesting. We have Leary sweeping Sito. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised at that. Sito, yes, he had a nice job, but, he did a nice job. He was able to take out ACCM and MBL, but once he just run into Leary, then it's a bit of a rough time, so to say. Then we had Winchester 4-1 over Yo. I'd say that these two have semi-similar playstyles, and I think the big difference is that Winchester showed that being able to win in the early game, especially against someone like Mr. Yo, is really all it takes to win, like in a huge series, and win very decisively. Just Yo could not keep up with Winchester in like Feudal Age, and that just allowed Winchester to, number 2 out of the top 4 players. First you beat Hera, now you beat Yo. Viper having a relatively easy time with Valessa, only losing game number 1, where he lost 4 sheep against Tadars, who had then 4 more sheep, and that wasn't great. But then Viper came back with a vengeance and was able to sweep. And then Jordan and Tato having a very, very close and hard-fought set, but just at the very end, Jordan ended up being a little bit more solid of a player and was then able to advance to the semifinals. First semifinal, Vinch 4-1 over Leary, and it was just, again, smart play from Winchester, playing really strategically and tactically both, and just having the micro you need to keep up with Leary, and then just always looking towards that next step. Leary's trying to go aggressive on 1 TC, Vinch, he is already going on 2 TCs, is already, looking to the Imperial Age and all that stuff. I'll talk more about that later. And then Viper, honestly, not having too much difficulty with Jordan, the only game he lost being kind of a failed Men-at-Arm rush. And that, of course, brings us Viper and Winchester in the finals. But first, we had the Leary-Jordan third-placed match. Nothing really to talk about here. Jordan just looked like a step below Leary. And then we had Viper in the grand finals, able to win quite decisively, I would say, over Winchester. Vinch was able to take a couple games here and there, but ultimately Viper simply looked to be a cut above his opponent. And so those are the results of the tournament. I guess when we look at like the big storylines, Viper, winning the event, like I said. Winchester, he almost did the 4-for-4. He defeated Leary, Yo, and Hera all in a row, and just ultimately lost to the Viper, that fourth of who we usually call the top 4 players these days. Still a fantastic result for him, and somebody that I think people really need to look out for in future events. When this guy is prepared, it is really tough to deal with him. And yeah, it's kind of like he can struggle against, was it Sito? No, Kosfa. Like, he barely beat Kosfa. He has a lot of obvious sort of weaknesses in his gameplay, but kind of like Doubt, who it's like, okay, Doubt's weakness is his micro, but he's great everywhere else, so he's still a very threatening player. Winchester, his weakness is his macro, and his macro is not perfect, to say the least. But everything else is so good, and he's so smart that he is able to win in these big important sets when he is prepared. Jordan, I think a pretty good result for him. He looks really strong, and he's looked like, okay, Jordan, he's a really good player. But I feel that once you sort of hit the top tier players playing well, I simply haven't seen that next step from Jordan, where I don't see him actually winning a tournament anytime soon, unfortunately. I think he honestly kind of needs to step up his game a little bit. He doesn't sort of have the same, I guess you would call killer instinct that someone like Winchester does. And Jordan, he's just very sort of, I guess, standard meta, macro-oriented. And he does it really well, and I think more importantly, really consistently, which is how he can get all of these good results. I just kind of want to see that next step from him. Leary getting third place, I mean, anything less than winning the tournament is going to be disappointing for him, but still decent result. Yo going out in the quarterfinals, probably not what he would want, but everything else, Sito having a nice tournament, Tato almost making it, and then of course you have Hera and MBL and Doubt even going out in the group stage. So a tournament with plenty of upsets, plenty of interesting storylines, but in the end it is the Viper who takes the gold. So with our tournament and storyline results done, let's go ahead and move on to the actual AOE2 stuff. Alright, speaking now more to the Age of Empires 2e side of things, of course this is what I'm always super interested in as a caster, I guess, like I love the game and talking about it, but before we even talk about, strategies or civilizations or anything like that, the metagame, I just want to go over the map script we have for KOTD4, because with every Arabia, for every tournament, ever since, I started casting at the very least, and a little bit before as well, every tournament kind of has their own take on Arabia, that classic AOE2 map. Everyone has kind of a different idea of what that should look like, and I just kind of wanted to go over briefly what that looked like in this tournament. We also had the interesting, aspect where you had the tournament version of Arabia on the ladder. So it was actually, and is, as I'm recording it, literally the game's Arabia, like just default Arabia is the version used in KOTD4. So let me go over to that for a second. All right, so here I am in the editor. I just literally loaded up a small Arabia with, 1v1. And what we can see here is that, one, I enabled big trees, and two, that it's, in general, a very open map. The wood lines are super far away. I wanted to be able to zoom, so I just loaded up the map script. So yeah, as you can see, the wood lines are very far away from the TC, and this led to a lot of early quick walling, especially because we also had the Palisade Wall cost hike and the House Armor nerf. So we saw a lot of very aggressive openings, a lot of militia, a lot of men-at-arms, not a lot of scouts, and definitely not many fast castles. Also, because it's King of the Desert, you also have the African fauna, which means that you have elephants instead of boar. Now, this is important because elephants have 60 more food, or rhinos. Elephants and rhinos are the same, both having 60 more food than the boar does. So players were more easily able to go for, I think, very early rushes, whether that be for the 2 men-at-arm rush, a lot of 18, 19, 20 pop uptime, stuff that's a lot harder with boar. And you also have your ostriches and zebras. They are your deer equivalents, usually something where you can push them without too much issue. But beyond that, there were just like a lot of tiny little hills, no cliffs, the occasional oasis. You could say that this is probably one of the closer Arabia versions compared to like the original AOC Arabia, as far as tournament versions go. But yeah, definitely much more focused on the open side of things, and I think especially when it comes to having very far wood lines. Hello again. So now I kind of want to talk about, okay, what sorts of strategies did we see? The first thing that jumps to mind is the 2 militia drush. This is kind of what I was alluding to. Vinchester did it in like almost every single game he played, at least in the later stages of the tournament, and it's a strategy where it's usually pre-mill. So you usually go with the barracks before the mill, and then you build just 2 militia, so you don't have to mine any gold, and then you send those guys out and you start to harass your opponent. Now, in some cases, if your opponent was unprepared, then yeah, you get like a villager kill or maybe even 2, and then the game's like, all but over. But in most cases, this doesn't really kill your opponent. It's a drush with a specific goal in mind to prevent your opponent from walling completely and getting themselves situated. Usually, you're able to quick wall in your villagers, as in like, okay, you have your villagers protected at your wood lines, at your forage bushes, at your gold mines, whatever. So the militia don't do damage, but it means that your base is still as a whole open, and what you do is the follow-up is you go up to the feudal age quite quickly, usually between 21 to 23 villagers, and then it's like the 1-2 punch. The 2 militia come in, they make you all, hiding in your little corners, and then the archers come in as a follow-up, and then they really start to harass your villagers. And if you are not able to, defend against that, we saw many, many games simply end just by that guy running in and killing some villagers and then just kind of snowballing the game from there. So that was definitely sort of the breakout build of the tournament. I don't think I've really seen this build before, but it was very much popular throughout the entire event. And again, I think that is in part due to the map script and in part due to just the meta these days, those Palisade nerfs and house nerfs. You might think that, okay, if we're nerfing Palisade walls and houses, then that is going to make scout openings more effective. That's actually not the case, because it means that the best openings are going to be the fastest openings. So your militia openings, your men-at-arm openings, and then your super quick archer openings as sort of the counter to the militia and men-at-arms. The issue with scouts is that, well, you can't make them until you get to the feudal age, right? And with militia openings, well, you can just make them in the Dark Age and then upgrade them to men-at-arms in the feudal age. That's also a potential follow-up to the 2 militia drush, by the way. Is like you add in a couple more, you hit feudal age, and then you turn them into men-at-arms. But yeah, the scouts we saw some play with them, especially from Scout Civs. We saw them from Franks, we saw them from Huns, Khmer, all that stuff. So it's not like it wasn't viable. But I think people's ideal of okay, let's just have 21 pop scouts be the meta, making Arabia more aggressive isn't going to actually make that happen, I guess. Simply, walls are an important tool, not just against scouts, but when you're going for scouts, because it helps you not just die to the early aggression. Also, we saw a little bit of tower aggression, but not too much, so I think it really goes to show that tower rushes are still pretty weak. Ever since they got their nerf where they only have 700 HP in the Feudal Age as opposed to 1080, so minus 380 HP, just not quite as effective as they used to be in ye old days. So that was definitely the more common trends we saw as far as strategeries go. We saw plenty of Cav Archers, plenty of Knights, plenty of Crossbowmen. I'd say the Crossbowman was probably the unit of choice. We did not see any Longswordsmen, at least not many. We saw some Champion play, and we did actually see Longswordsmen occasionally, but that was mostly against Eagle Warriors. Yeah, the Longswordsman buff, I don't know if it's a matter of it just simply wasn't enough to make Longswordsmen more popular, or it's a matter of, okay, these guys simply haven't had the time to practice crazy new ways of playing Age of Empires, with the patch happening just before the main event started. So we'll have to, I think, wait and see as far as the swordsmen go, but pretty much every other unit was utilized a bunch. Not really that many unique units, but that's just not something yet that you see on Arabia all that often. Anyway, let's go to the stats spreadsheet. Nerfox was at first not going to do this spreadsheet, but then I'm like, hey, Nerfox, can I, have your template so I can do the spreadsheet? And then he's like, fine, Ornlu, I'll just do the spreadsheet. So Nerfox did almost all of this. All I did was just input some data here and there. So yeah, this is mostly Nerfox and his wonderful work. Let's talk about some civs. So the three amigos of this event, to the surprise of I think very few people, Aztecs, Chinese, and Mayans, they are, in my opinion, the three S-tier Arabia civs. They are a cut above, and they are the only three civilizations that had a 100% pick rate in the tournament, or at least they were seen in 100% of drafts as either a picked civ or a banned civ. So in most cases, these civs were actually banned. So yeah, you have Aztecs banned 33 out of 44 drafts, Chinese 35 out of 44, and then Mayans 28 out of 44. So yeah, those civs, they definitely didn't really have that many games, and we can actually see that Mayans, they went 7-5, so they did pretty well for themselves, not that huge of a sample size. Chinese were only actually played 4 times. Personally, I felt that Chinese actually weren't as good as you might normally assume that they are, because they don't love going for drushes, and they don't love going for men-at-arm rushes, and that's kind of what the meta was all about. So I think Chinese were banned constantly, but they also weren't really quite as good as I think a lot of people would have expected them to be. And then we have Aztecs going 5-1, the classic showing of, oh hey, why didn't you ban Aztecs against me? They are still just the best Arabia civ in my opinion, just so strong at being aggressive and just following it up with any sort of feudal age, castle age play. You can go eco, you can go with 1TC play. They just have so many options that are so deadly. And the only loss that the civilization had was in a game between Yo and Vinchester, which was just one of the best games of the tournament, in my opinion. Vinch played extremely well, so did Yo, but it was just, one of those really, really, really close games, and that went late. But moving beyond the top 3, we also had a lot of other civs that were very frequently seen. Berbers were played a bunch, but with very little success. Only 6 and 13, so 32% win rate from them. Not the most impressive showing. I'm not too sure why we saw them so much. I feel like they're a civ that loves being in the Castle Age, right? And going from Castle Age to Imperial Age. They don't really have any bonuses for early game other than your faster moving villagers, which is nice, but it's not, a top tier early game by any means. So we had so many games where you really prioritized the early game, Dark Feudal Age, and then Berbers aren't really shining there, so they kind of got overrun in a lot of situations. So yeah, not a great showing from them. Britons, meanwhile, had a very strong showing at 15 wins and 8 losses, 65% win rate. The 2 militia drush meta into archers follow-up, that just suits Britons perfectly. They have that early faster gathering shepherd bonus that you can use to go for the very consistent drush. Then you have the archer follow-up in feudal age, and then get to castle age, and then you can do Briton things. This is just a meta that heavily favored that sort of play style, and of course Britons are going to exceed in that sort of situation. It's also why we saw Vietnamese jumping towards the end here, when going 9-5, another sort of surprise, I guess, strong civ of the tournament, 64% win rate from them. And again, they are able to execute that early meta so effectively. But instead of having like the better economy in the Dark Age, like Britons do, they instead have the ability to lame super consistently because they know where your enemy town center is. So that was sort of their early game bonus, so to say. I know people don't like laming. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but it's a just reality for the tournament, and that was an important tool for Vietnamese in a lot of games. Byzantine saw a lot of play. They went 9-10, so pretty much a 50-50 civ, but we really weren't seeing Byzantines a ton in tournaments, at least not on open maps, but having that sort of very grindy, early, scrappy game, that really favors Byzantines. In the metas that are the most aggressive, the strong aggressive civs shine, but also the strong defensive civs shine because they're the ones most able to deal with the early aggression, right? And that's what Byzantines are great at. Still, they did, essentially have a 50% win rate. 9-10, could have been 10-9. Just a good, solid Arabia civ. Celts went 1-6. Definitely not a civ that loved the meta. You'd think they would because of their early game potential and then going into Castle Age aggression. But simply, they didn't really perform that well. Not the strongest archer play, not the strongest knight play, and I think that Celts are a civ that would really like to experiment more with the swordsman line. At least I've been doing that, but of course I'm a pleb, so who knows. But yeah, Celts, not the greatest tournament for them. Franks did fall into the 7-9 category, so not terrible by any means, but they don't love going for, the militia into archer play, men-at-arm into archers. They much prefer going for scouts into cavalry, and that just wasn't the dominant strategy of the event. It was just so difficult for the Frank player and any sort of cavalry-centric civ to make use of the mobility of cavalry. This is a tournament where mobility wasn't actually the most important thing, because simply outranging your opponent's wood lines, because the wood lines are small and far away from your town center, means that archers are just so strong, because you can't really hide. You can't hide at all against the archer play. And yeah, you can make it work, but it just wasn't the most consistent of option. Huns, similarly, 12-17, not a great showing, but a ton of play, mostly going down the cav archer route, but they did end up not really having the greatest time of things, not very good defensively, and if you run into faster civilizations, like other fast civilizations, Huns can struggle. I would say Incas and Japanese both had pretty decent showings. Incas 7-5, Japanese 6-7. They are civilizations that can do quite well in these sort of early game infantry into archer-centric openings. So definitely not amazing civs, but definitely very solid contenders. Now here's the weird one. Indians. What to say of Indians? They were one of the best performing civs of the entire tournament, and when it comes to having a good win rate with a lot of games played, Indians are easily number one. So it's like, what the heck's going on? 18-7 were Indians. This is a civ that I know I'm not a big fan of on Arabia, at least not going into this tournament, and I know a lot of other people were not big fans of this civ. There are a few reasons for this. I talked about this in my 1v1 Arabia tier list video, but in a world where you can ban Aztecs and Mayans especially, Indians are going to be much happier, because Indians have a terrible matchup against Aztecs and Mayans. I also think they have a pretty bad matchup against Chinese, personally. So being able to ban away the very, very best civs where you have sort of disproportionately bad matchups, that's really good for Indians. Also, Indians are able to then leverage good matchups against a lot of other popular civs. They ran into Berbers a lot, they ran into Tatars a lot, and they ran into Huns a lot. All of those sorts of situations Indians do quite well, but it's not because of camels. We did see some camel play from Indians, but it wasn't like, the dominating strategy by any means. We saw a lot of cav archer play from Indians. And cav archers, they are going to be doing quite well against civs that are a bit more focused on melee units, right? Cav archer is able to hit and run and do all that stuff. Against archer civs, when Indians showed up, it was a lot of pure skirmishers. Having that strong early eco where you have the cheaper villagers, you're much more easily able to go for that 2 militia drush into skirmishers. Oftentimes you just saw 4 range skirmishers into Imperial Age, and it was just skirm hussar, never really even making any gold units. And that's the sort of style that worked out really, really well with Indians throughout this tournament. I don't know, however, how much that's going to translate to good ladder play. Khmer, not a great showing, 9 wins and 15 losses, 38% win rate. They are not a civ that love the meta of going for early drushes and men-at-arm rushes because, they would rather skip the barracks completely if they can get away with it. And if you're going into a scout war, then Khmer are also going to be pretty sad because you want to skip the barracks, because if you don't, then you're giving up one of your strongest eco bonuses in the early game, but then you like don't have the ability to make spearmen, and it's just kind of awkward. Khmer, they are a great civ still, but just not one that loves the current meta or map generation. Lithuanians, Mongols both having decent showings. Sicilians as well, definitely a pretty popular civ, and 11 and 13, not like an amazing win rate, but still definitely solidifying themselves as a strong civilization. Tatars as well, also quite popular. And then Vietnamese, I already talked about earlier, being really good. And Vikings, also kind of underwhelming at 7 and 11. This is data from the main event, as you can see here. So no thumb ring on these guys, but that really wasn't so much the issue as it was that Vikings don't love the Dark Age, right? You think, okay, Vikings, like best eco in the game. And yeah, I guess. But you don't get that until Feudal Age. You don't get that until you get a bunch of farms going. And if you aren't able to get to Feudal Age super easily and you have these extended Dark Ages, then Vikings aren't quite as good and they just don't have that power in the late game. That said, it's not like they completely embarrassed themselves, but still not really, I think, quite as good of a showing as, say, 15 bans throughout the tournament would indicate. Anyway, those are the civ stats for the event. I think I've already talked about that plenty, so let's go back to the general background. So just to briefly summarize before I move on to the more community-focused stuff, KOTD4 had a lot of, I guess, interesting meta developments based around the balance of the game, based around the map script, and of course player preference. And we just saw that develop throughout the tournament with first, drushes being popular, like 3 militia drushes, then men-at-arm rushes being super popular, and then people switched to the 2 militia drush or the very quick archer opening, and then men-at-arm rushes like faded almost completely. And it was just an interesting, development throughout the tournament. And then, some civs are going to do better in that situation compared to others. Very interesting stuff, at least to me. But yes, last but not least, KOTD4 in AOE2. What to say about KOTD4 in the AOE2 community? Obviously, this is just my, I guess, subjective opinion as an outsider, I guess. But this is just my gathering, just from, casting the event and just looking at the community interest, I guess. So the first bullet point there I have is general interest. And by that, I mean just like the community in general. Is there a lot of demand for an AOE2 tournament? I would say yes. The viewer numbers, I think, were very strong, especially in a world where T90 and Viper are no longer on Twitch. They are on Facebook. So if you don't have those huge polls, then it's a little bit more tricky to, get the really high viewer numbers. But Memb still had fantastic viewer numbers. So, I mean, certainly kudos to him for being successful in that way. And I had decent viewer numbers, and I think pretty much anybody who was streaming the event had pretty good viewer numbers. And just by looking at, Discord and Reddit and AOE Zone even, very occasionally, going to the dark recesses of the AOE2 community. But there was a lot of talk about the tournament. People were interested. People liked all the storylines, the upsets, and everything like that. And I guess I kind of want to contrast that with pro player interest, where we had this weird situation where a lot of the very top pro players, especially the ones that are very vocal and have a lot of, influence in terms of just the community at large, weren't all that excited for KOTD4. A lot of them are more interested in AOE4 and or are more interested in AOE4, but they still signed up for the tournament. I'm not going to say that, people who played AOE4 a bunch, did not do well and people who didn't did really well or vice versa. Yeah, you had Hera who had an underwhelming tournament, but then you had Viper who's been playing a lot of AOE4 and he won the whole event. So I actually don't think that there's really a super close connection between players who did a lot of AOE4 versus those who didn't in terms of performance in the event. But I still think that you kind of had a lot of, tension, because you have a lot of the pro players, not all of them, don't get me wrong, it's certainly not all of them, but a lot of them were really much more interested in AOE4. That didn't necessarily reflect at least the community, the AOE2 community. I mean, I'm sure AOE4 events are still going to be doing just fine, but in terms of overall player base, the two games seem pretty similar right now. So I think that at least the takeaway for me is that AOE2 is going to be doing just fine. I guess that goes into the whole event success thing. AOE2 is not going anywhere. It was a good tournament. I think it hit all the marks in terms of it was, run quite well. It had good viewer numbers. It had competitive games, and it had interesting games. All of the things that you would think are important for a tournament. Even though this is after AOE4, I still think that there is a big hunger for high-level AOE2 events, which is great to see because I know a lot of people were like, oh my god, is this the last AOE2 tournament? When you see the tournament getting the interest and the numbers that KOTD4 did, I don't think you have to worry about there not being another huge AOE2 tournament. And as far as the pro players saying like, oh, I'm just going to focus on AOE4 right now, like everyone has a different situation, right? I mean, you can't really talk about every single AOE2/4 pro in like one blanket statement, but I will be convinced that players will have quote unquote moved on to AOE4 over AOE2 when there is an S tier AOE2 event. So like, at least $10,000, $20,000 prize pool AOE2 event that these top players don't sign up for. So just as an example, if Viper obviously really likes AOE4 right now. If he like moves on to AOE4, I will say that has happened only when there's the next huge tournament that Viper just doesn't sign up for. Until such a time happens, I think that we're doing just fine. People's interest, it will, shift between AOE2 to AOE4, then back to AOE2, then back to AOE4. I think that really both games are just quite different and can coexist simultaneously. At least that's my opinion. But I think that at least the more objective thing and takeaway, I suppose, is that it was a good event. It was an enjoyable event. There were lots of upsets. There were lots of storylines, but you still had a lot of top players doing quite well. You had new strategies, but also old strategies be successful. And, you had sort of breakout civs like Indians and Vietnamese to some extent, but then, you also had your classic standbys of Britons and Aztecs, and even Huns all being very popular. So I think it also shows that AOE2, there's so much more to discover in the game, and there's so much more to learn and so much more to figure out, and it's not stale. The tournament did not feel stale, which I think is also really important when it speaks to, like, the quality of gameplay. It doesn't feel like, okay, here's another Arabia tournament. It's all the same stuff. No, we saw a lot of variety. Like, yeah, sure, we had a meta, of course, right? I mean, it's not like everything is different, but within the, I guess, spectrum of potential for like an AOE2 event, it's not like we saw the same thing over and over and over and over and over again in every single game, which made it much more fun to cast, and I'm sure to watch. So in conclusion, AOE2, it does have a bright future ahead of it, at least in my opinion. I can't really speak to like, oh, I know there are all these tournaments coming up. I actually have no idea. I'm just clueless, but I would still guess that AOE2 is going to be doing okay, more than okay even. And I think there's just, like I said, a lot of interest in the event. And of course, kudos to Memb and everyone else who was working on that. They had a whole production team that was doing a really great job. They had some technical difficulties at the end, but they were able to power through it. So again, able to react to that situation quite nicely. So good for them. Thumbs up. But that's going to be it for me, guys. Definitely let me know in the comments what you thought of KOTD4. Did you enjoy the event? What, in your opinion, was the biggest takeaway? Could be AOE2, could be the cool community thing. Yeah, just let me know. And thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.